Imagine you could go back, not to fix a mistake, not to warn anyone, just to watch. You're standing on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange, September 3rd, 1929. The ticker is printing fortunes. The crowd is loud, electric, certain. Nobody in that room believes it will ever stop. And then it stops. Within 3 years, nearly 9 out of every $10 invested at that peak simply vanishes. Not moved, not transferred, gone. If you had $10,000 in the market that September morning, by the summer of 1932, you would have been left with roughly $1,080. That's not a loss. That's near total destruction. But here's what the textbooks don't tell you. Some people who invested at the very worst moment in American financial history, the absolute peak, right before everything fell apart, still ended up wealthy. Not by luck, not by genius, by doing almost nothing at all. This is the story of what that $10,000 actually became, depending on one single variable: what you decided to do when the world felt like it was ending. The 1920s were intoxicating. The economy had been booming for most of the decade. Cars were everywhere. Radio was new. Jazz was loud. And the stock market felt like a machine that only moved in one direction. Ordinary people, not just bankers, not just industrialists, were pouring their savings into stocks. The idea that everyone could get rich simply by buying a share of America felt for a brief moment genuinely true. But underneath the music, something was badly wrong. By September of 1929, stock prices had been pushed to extraordinary heights. The market's price-to-earnings ratio, a measure of how expensive stocks are relative to actual company profits, had climbed to roughly 32.6. That was more than double the historical average. Stocks weren't just expensive, they were priced for a future that had never existed. On September 3rd, 1929, the Dow Jones Industrial Average, the most closely watched barometer of American stocks, peaked at 381. It would not see that number again for 25 years. The slide began quietly. A few bad days, then a few more. And then on October 28th and 29th, the floor gave way entirely. In just 2 trading days, the market fell more than 23%. Traders stood in the street. Men wept. The ticker tape ran hours behind the actual prices because the machines couldn't keep up with the speed of the collapse. Now place yourself inside that moment. You are our investor. You put $10,000 into the market at the September peak, not because you were reckless, but because every signal around you said this was the rational thing to do. And now, in late October, you're already down by nearly a third. You're watching the number fall every single day. What do? Most people in 1929 made the same choice. They waited, not because they were disciplined, because they were stunned. The mind struggles to accept a loss that large as real. So they held on, telling themselves it would come back. It didn't come back. Not for a long time. 1931, the worst single year in the entire history of the Dow, saw the index fall another 48%, not from the original peak, from where it already was after 2 years of losses. By the summer of 1932, the Dow had fallen to 41.22, down 89.2% from its high. Your $10,000 was now worth just over $1,000. And the world outside the market was no better. 1 in 4 American workers had no job. Entire families lined up for bread. Banks, nearly 9,000 of them, had failed, taking their depositors' savings with them. Gross domestic product, the sum of everything a country produces and sells in a year, had shrunk by roughly 30%. The numbers describe a collapse, but they don't describe the fear. This is the bottom. July 1932. And this is the moment when our story splits into 3 very different paths. The first investor, the holder, never sells. Through all of it, the crash, the depression, the bank failures, the breadlines, They sit on their $1,080 in market value and they wait. The second investor, the panic seller, looks at the news in July of 1932, decides they cannot take any more pain, and sells everything. They lock in the loss. They walk away with roughly $1,000 from their original $10,000, and they never come back. The third investor keeps putting in small amounts every single month throughout the entire crash. This strategy is called dollar cost averaging, putting in a fixed amount of money at regular intervals, regardless of what the market is doing. When prices fall, your fixed amount buys more shares. When prices rise, it buys fewer. The panic seller's story ends quickly and quietly. They leave the market in the summer of 1932 with about 10 cents for every dollar they put in. The pain of holding through those 3 years was real, but the pain of selling at the bottom is something different. Because within just a few months of the July 1932 low, the market began to recover sharply. In 1933 alone, the Dow gained 57%. The panic seller watched that from the sidelines. They had locked in their loss permanently. This is what behavioral economists call loss aversion. The very human tendency to feel the pain of a loss more intensely than the pleasure of an equivalent gain. It's the emotion that makes selling at the bottom feel like relief when it is actually the worst possible move. Now, the holder, the person who bought at the peak and never sold through any of it. The road is long, and we should be honest about just how long. The Dow did not recover its 1929 peak on a nominal basis, meaning in raw dollar terms, not adjusted for anything, until November of 1954. 25 years. If you bought at the top in 1929 and simply held, you waited a quarter of a century just to break even in name. But here's where the story gets complicated. And this is the part most people never hear. Dividends. Throughout those 25 years, many companies kept paying dividends, small regular cash payments made to shareholders just for owning the stock. A dividend is a company sharing a portion of its profits directly with the people who own it. If the holder was reinvesting those dividends, using the cash to buy more shares, their actual break-even point arrived significantly earlier than 1954. The 25-year headline obscures a more complicated truth. By the 1950s, if the holder stayed in through the recovery and the post-war boom, their $10,000 had grown to a sum that far exceeded where they started. The patient investor, over a long enough horizon, was rewarded. Now let's follow the third path, the investor who kept buying through the crash. Imagine putting in $50 every single month beginning in September of 1929. In the first year, those purchases feel like throwing money into a fire. The market is falling and everything you buy immediately loses value. But by the time the market bottoms in July of 1932, you've been buying shares at prices that are 60, 70, 80% below where they started. You've accumulated far more shares for the same monthly outlay than you ever could have at the peak. Your average cost per share is dramatically lower than the original September price. When the recovery begins, and the recovery does begin, those cheaply acquired shares start compounding. Compounding means your gains earn their own gains. The growth builds on itself. And because you started from such a low cost basis, the returns on those Depression-era purchases are extraordinary. This is not a comfortable strategy. It requires something most people fundamentally lack during a crisis: the ability to keep acting rationally when every emotion is screaming at you to stop. Benjamin Graham, the man who would go on to teach Warren Buffett everything he knew about investing, lost roughly 70% of his own portfolio in the crash. And from that devastation, he built the intellectual framework for modern value investing. The idea that a falling price is not a reason to flee, but potentially a reason to buy. So what does all of this mean in actual dollars? The panic seller walked away with roughly $1,000 from an original $10,000. a loss of 90% permanently realized because they were never in the market for the recovery. The holder endured 25 years of uncertainty but eventually saw genuine growth. The dollar cost averager, by turning the worst market in history into a buying opportunity, ended up with the strongest position of all three. But there's one more layer. During the Depression, consumer prices fell about 25%. This is called deflation, when the overall level of prices in an economy falls, meaning each dollar you hold actually buys more than it used to. Even the holder's shrunken portfolio, as painful as it was, bought more in real goods and services than the raw number suggested. And one more quiet truth about the long game: research on stock market history consistently shows that over any 25-year period, including ones that contain catastrophic crashes, the market has delivered average annual returns of roughly 10%. Not every year, not smoothly, but across time. The crash didn't break that pattern, it was part of it. So come back now to that trading floor. September 3rd, 1929. The ticker printing fortunes. The crowd, certain, loud, electric. The people in that room weren't fools. They were human. They made the decisions that felt rational given everything they could see. And some of them, the ones who panicked, who sold at the bottom, who never came back, were destroyed not by the crash itself, but by how they responded to it. The single insight at the center of everything in this story is this: in financial markets, time is the variable that turns catastrophe into opportunity. The crash was real. The pain was real. But the outcome for every one of our three investors was determined less by the market and more by what they decided to do while they waited. You now know something that most people watching markets today still haven't fully internalized. The worst moment to invest is rarely the last moment to invest, and the decision that feels safest in a crisis is often the one that costs the most.